So one thing that struck me was when you were talking about climate change and climate science, and how telling people that even if we are wrong about this, which we're not, it kind of benefits to follow like cleaning up the air and getting rid of pollution and like all the pollutants and things like that. Do you think that kind of messaging could have helped us with COVID-19? Because people tried a variety of different messages of how to get people to wear masks and uptake the vaccination program and follow the rules. Do you think it would have been a good way to just be transparent and say, well, if we are wrong, it's better that you followed this advice than none at all?
Yes, absolutely. And I think for two reasons. First of all, I think we have a lot of evidence from social science research that transparency generally is helpful for building bonds of trust. If people think you're hiding something, they do not believe you. And I mean, and this is part of the problem here in the United States. There's the perception that the Trump administration hid a lot of information, rushed through the vaccination approval process. And so this has built distrust in a number of different communities. But also, I think, you know, what you hit on is exactly right. If we were to say to people, and some people did try to say this, but I don't think the message was always as clear as it could have been. Look, we acknowledge this is a novel virus. That's the whole point here. And there are things about this virus that we really do not yet understand at all. I mean, this virus is weird in a number of ways. It has an incredibly wide range of potential symptoms. It can be deadly in some people, and it can be totally asymptomatic in others. So we have a lot to learn. But what we know is that we have a lot of experience with viruses, a variety of kinds, including other coronaviruses. We know that wearing masks can slow or stop the spread of viruses. And it's a pretty easy thing to do. You know, a mask doesn't cost much money. It's not hard, takes a second to put it on. And so we're asking you to do this because we have good reason to believe that it will help and almost no reason to think that it would hurt. And I do think that if people had sent a message like that clearly early on, it wouldn't have solved all the problems. It certainly would not have solved the problem of the politicization of mask wearing here in the United States. But I think for a lot of people, a message like that would have come across as reasonable. And that's what we want, right? We want not just to come across as reasonable, but we want to be reasonable. And we want people to see us as reasonable people giving reasonable advice. Mm. But not pretending, not being know-it-alls, right? Because we all know nobody likes a know-it-all, right?
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of know-it-alls, there seem to be a couple of prominent scientific figures, especially on social media, that not claim, but are always making statements of science is the fact, it's the truth, and without it, there's nothing. Which sometimes seem to come off as quite strong and seem to dismiss anybody that maybe questions anything they do or any work. Much like people that doubt science completely, do you think this is harmful in how people accept science and like what people are telling them? Or do you think the strong approach of trust everything that science does is helpful in some way?
Obviously, that's a leading question because, yes. But my answer is going to go. And I think this is a really important question. I think we need to do a lot more empirical work to try to understand what it is that people are hearing when we communicate with them, because so much communication is supply side, right? We send this stuff out, but we often don't really do the work to follow up to really fully understand how it's understood, particularly in diverse communities. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in that area. And in fact, I've just been talking to a potential postdoc about doing some work like that. So if anyone knows a funder who might like to fund work in this area, please get in touch. You can easily find me, Naomi Oreskes at Harvard. But I think that overall, the message that, the sort of science is the fact, science is always right. I think it's a bad message because it's not true. And again, if we want people to believe us, we have to be honest about the limitations of our own practices. So as a historian of science, one of the things I say is we cannot honestly say that science always gets it right. That's just not true. And the second half of my book, the second chapter, actually looks in detail about some famous, well, a couple of famous and some less well-known cases where scientists did, quote, get it wrong by the standards of hindsight. And I look closely at, well, what happened in those cases? And we find some interesting things, some of which are surprising. The most interesting thing I think we found in that work, and some of which I knew before, but some of which I actually didn't, was that some of these things where there's people will claim that scientists said X. When we look closely, we actually find that there was a fairly significant debate at the time, and there wasn't consensus. And so this is one reason why I believe consensus is an important category for us to understand in terms of judging and evaluating scientific claims. If there truly is a debate going on, then we have to be open about that debate. But we also have to be willing to flag genuine scientific debate versus disinformation. And of course, that's what my book, Merchants of Doubt, was all about. And it's not always easy to tell the difference. You know, we see Facebook struggling right now with that issue. So we can't just say, oh, trust scientists. That just doesn't work. So we have to engage in a conversation in which we're willing to say, yeah, we do sometimes get things wrong. Scientists are humans. Scientists are fallible like all human beings. But overall, we have good reason to think X, and then explain what that is. So as one of my students once put it when I was first working on this book, she said, oh, so what you're saying is it's not enough just to say what we know, but we need to explain how we know it. And I think that's exactly right. And so just getting up there and like blowing the horn of science is basically amounting to saying, trust me, I'm the expert. And that's just not, it's not helpful and it's not true.
I think anything that we can do to make people realize that you can't just go on someone's word for everything and all the time and just listen to everything, that would be good. We've had lots of questions come through the chat whilst we've been talking, which is great. So I'll start with G. Wilkinson asks, can a true hypothesis make false predictions?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And for the same reasons that a false one can make true predictions, right? Because if you think about hypotheses not simply as statements, but as sort of networks of belief, then there's always going to be embedded assumptions and beliefs in the test. And so that means that they can go either way. You could have a false theory that makes true predictions, which therefore you then wrongly accept, but the opposite. A true theory can make false predictions, you know, because there's some detail that's not right, and it might take time to work out. And this is one of the major reasons why I think, and many philosophers think, that Popper's theory of falsification is incomplete. You know, there's a lot to be said for many of the things that Karl Popper highlighted in his philosophy of science, but the idea that if you test a hypothesis and it fails, well, that's it, you're done. You know, you did your job, you falsified the theory, and life marches on. No, that's not actually what scientists do. When scientists do a test of a theory and it fails, most of the time people blame the test, right? And with good reason, because there's a good chance that the test might be wrong. And so you don't just throw out the theory because it failed a particular test. You say, well, okay, let me look again. Maybe I need to think of this in a different way, redesign the experiment, collect a different set of observations. And this is also why it's more helpful, in my opinion, to think about science as bodies of knowledge rather than tests of hypotheses. Because if we think about an important theory, I mean, the one I've studied most closely is the theory of plate tectonics. That was not accepted on the basis of one line of evidence or one crucial experiment, but a body of evidence that developed over the course of the better part of half a century from a variety of different subspecialties within earth science. And when the evidence started to come together and different people looking at it from different angles and with different tools all began to say, oh, yes, this seems right. That's when the theory was accepted. And I would say that that's right, that that's rightly so, that robust theories, theories that stand the test of time, are ones that have been supported by evidence from a variety of different sources. And that's what makes something like COVID-19 so tough, right? When you have an emergency based on something that's truly new, in the early stages, there's no way you're going to be able to do that right away. It's going to take some time. And in most science, most people don't really care because they don't even really know. I mean, it turns out biologists have been working on messenger RNA vaccines for at least a decade. Most of us didn't know that because why would we? There was no reason to know. So then it becomes, now we have these vaccines and suddenly it seems like they're brand new and they've come out of nowhere. And it turns out that's not quite true. And that's important for us to understand too, because, you know, if this thing were truly absolutely brand new, well, then we would have good reason to be at least a little cautiously skeptical, right? And we still have reasons to be concerned because we're now testing this vaccine on literally billions of people. And my view is that it is likely that we will detect some adverse effects that did not show up in the clinical trials. That's probably going to happen. And so if that does happen, we shouldn't say, oh my God, the scientists lied to us. Oh my God, they betrayed us. No, but this is where scientists have to be honest and not deny that there could be adverse side effects, but say, yeah, we get it. There will be some side effects, and we're going to do everything we can to take care of anybody who has a bad side effect. And that's why if you get a vaccine, it's really important to pay attention, in the days and weeks after your vaccine. And if something doesn't seem right, go to the doctor, because vaccines do have adverse effects. And we know that some of these adverse effects can show up days, weeks, or maybe even months later. So let's be honest about that, but it still means that overall vaccination is going to be incredibly important for the world, and millions of lives will be saved, and trillions of dollars in economic activity will be recovered. So we know, we have very good evidence to say that the net effect of vaccination is going to be really, really good, but let's not deny that there will be some adverse effects, and some people will bear those consequences. And for those people, it may even feel kind of unfair. But that's sort of that's how public health works, right? It can't be perfect for all people in all situations, but we can hope that it's very, very, very good for almost everyone, and that the adverse effects for the rest are not too serious. Right?
I guess a very recent example of that is the blood clot warning that came with the AstraZeneca vaccination. And I saw a lot of people on Twitter then, like we were saying before, putting it into perspective with the risk of blood clots from when you get COVID-19, or from smoking, or even the contraceptive pill. Like when you look at it compared to those, it's the kind of thing of, we may not have known, but if you don't do it, the risks are worse than if you do.
Right, and it's interesting because I've written on the history of the pill, and I have a section in the book about, not about blood clots from the pill, but about mental health effects. But I could easily have written about the blood clot effect. There's actually a very interesting story about that, because many of the blood clots were in the eye. And so ophthalmologists were the first people to detect these effects. And at first, some other doctors didn't believe them, because they're like, it just seemed like the connection seemed too weird. And it took time to actually demonstrate that. But again, one thing that's important, I mean, this blood clot issue, it's tricky, and scientists are trying to work it out and figure out exactly what's going on. But I don't think it's enough to just say, well, the net effect is going to be good, so don't worry, or what would be worse if you took the pill? Because there is a difference between something that people do completely voluntarily and something that people do, under a certain degree of social pressure. So women who take the pill do that voluntarily. And it is important that they get good information about what potential side effects should be. And we do know that for a long time, women did not get good information. And I think probably in a lot of places today, that's still the case. I mean, I actually had a colleague one time who got a blood clot from the contraceptive pill and was completely stunned, A, to find out, and B, when she told me she had this blood clot in her eye, and I said, what are you on the pill? And she was like, how did you know that? I was like, well, I've actually studied this, right? So it is important that people have good information, and people often don't get the information they need. But there's still a difference between something that you do completely voluntarily versus, now we have these big public health efforts, and there is pressure on people to get vaccinated, and some employers are saying they'll require it. And so we do have to be, I think, a little, not, how do I put this, not be cavalier about it. I think sometimes people are cavalier and say, oh, but it's much less than if you took the pill. Yeah, that's not really an answer, in my opinion. I think the answer is more along the lines of what I just said. Yes, we're getting some evidence that this is a serious side effect. It's rare, and it may be the case. I mean, some countries have already said young people shouldn't get the AstraZeneca, and that might turn out to be the correct public health advice. So just pay attention, and if you feel something's not right after you get the shot, if you have a doctor, call a doctor. If you don't have a doctor, go to a local hospital or emergency room, to be aware that these side effects are a real thing, and not to discount it. But to try as much as possible to alert people, and then to support them to get the help they need if they need it, right? And not to be dismissive, because, again, I make a distinction between science and medicine, because it involves, direct practice with patients, has a different set of constraints and expectations than basic scientific research. But, doctors don't always have the greatest track record of taking patients' complaints seriously. And this is what I talk about in the book, in the section on the pill, that many women reported that they felt depressed, after going on the pill, and many doctors were dismissive. So it's kind of an argument for not being dismissive about what people are or think they are experiencing.
And you mentioned the mRNA vaccine seeming like it just appeared, it came out of the blue. So we've had a couple of talks in the past about the cover publication bias and how certain journals choose what science gets published, or funding bodies choose what gets funded. And we've had a couple of questions about how reliable is like the peer review process. So if you put all of this together, do you think this leads into the public maybe not trusting science as much as it could, because sometimes things just appear out of the blue, but it has been on the back burner, it's just not been publicized, or it's not got the clickbaity headline that the media like?
Yeah, this is a complicated issue. What I like to say about peer review is that it's an asymmetric test, or another way of thinking about it is that it's just a very low bar. So what peer review does, it's a kind of screen, and it tries as much as possible to screen out claims that are not supported by evidence, but it's a low bar. So many claims do get through that turn out not to be supported by future additional work. But the key thing, I think, is because it is such a low bar, it means that anything that has failed to pass peer review, you could be pretty sure it's likely to be crap, right? And if you look at a lot of climate change denial, a lot of vaccine refutation, almost none of this is in peer-reviewed journals, almost none. It's published in some, it's a pamphlet from some libertarian think tank, or a report from some who knows what organization. Often it's hard to even track the funding, but if you do, you may find that it's funded by regulated industry. There's a lot of pro-pesticide stuff that's funded by the pesticide industry. So one of the first things a person can ask if they're trying to judge a claim is to say, well, did this pass the test of peer review? If the answer is no, then you can be pretty certain in almost all cases, with some rare exceptions, but pretty certain it's probably bogus. Now, if it has passed peer review, that doesn't prove that it's true, but that's where the notion of bodies of evidence comes in. Sure, I could go to any area of science, whether it's seismology, virology, molecular biology, quantum physics, and I could find articles that are bogus, or that people later decided, no, that's not right. But that's how science works, right? That we don't just come to accept something because of one paper. We come to accept it when there's a body of information, ideally produced by lots of different labs or field workers in different parts of the world. And when the body of knowledge adds up and scientists say, yes, we think this is right, that's when you have what in most cases is probably reliable science. Now, the problem there is it's very hard for an ordinary person or even an ordinary journalist to judge that. But I think that's where journalists can help, right? By not running a story based on some single new article, which journalists do a lot, and I think it's very unhelpful, but by trying to place scientific claims into a bit more context. And that means doing more work. So I understand that anytime I ask people to do things that involve work, they may not want to do it, but sometimes it's pretty easy because you could call up your local historian of science and ask them to place this in context. And every historian of science I know would be happy to do that for any journalist who would take the time to call. Now, for ordinary citizens, it's of course harder, but that's partly why we now have in the modern world this development of assessment reports and statements of fact or statements of consensus by scientific societies. So for example, in the UK, the Royal Society, in my view, has done a very good job of trying to issue reports that help to put things in context for ordinary people. So a few years back, the Royal Society published what they called a guide to facts and fictions about climate change. And I thought that was a very useful summary of some of the key things that we did and didn't know about climate change. And it was written in a way that I think, well, sometimes scientists write things that they think are for the general public and they don't do a great job. But that particular one, I thought they did do a good job of using language that, most educated people could understand. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they do a somewhat less good job. Those reports are extremely long and very turgid, but the summaries for policymakers are moderately readable. I think they could do more to make them more readable and less jargon laden. And then in the United States here, the National Research Council puts out over 200 reports every year. So if there is a topic that you want to know what the state of the science is, you can find these reports, and they're almost all online now, and they're all publicly available. Well, almost all, I think. There might be a few that aren't, but these resources are there. And sometimes it takes a little effort. And I do think the scientific communities could do more to make it less effortful to find them, but the information is there. And I do think the scientific community has been making an effort, probably could do more, but has been making an effort to make this information available.
Very interesting. Vanessa has asked, if science is consensus of scientists judging evidence, to paraphrase, then surely diversity is critical. And while social media can be problematic, perhaps it's time to cautiously embrace it. Is it an interesting way to integrate those groups that have been historically excluded?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the major themes of the second half of the book is diversity. And so one of the arguments I make, which builds on this notion of science being a consensus of experts judging the weight of evidence, is that it's very important for those communities to be diverse. Because if those communities are very single-minded, then they may well miss important things, or they may well allow gender, race, or other forms of bias to influence their judgment of the evidence in inappropriate ways. And we do have evidence now that more diverse communities are more likely to pick out blind spots, to raise questions that had been neglected previously, or to offer other interpretations of data that had been previously neglected. Londa Schiebenger's work on gender and science is very helpful in this regard. And there's a big body of work on this now. So it means that it's extremely important for scientific institutions to take diversity seriously, to make meaningful steps to increase the diversity of those communities, and also to ensure that the diversity is more than skin deep. And by that, I mean, it's not enough to just invite people into the room. You actually have to be willing to listen. And this is something that has come up in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because the IPCC has made a huge effort, and I would say a very good effort, to include scientists from all over the globe. And their writer teams, their writer groups always have people not just from North America and Europe, but from other parts of the globe as well. I think this is really important and very, very good that they've done this. However, I have also heard sometimes in corridors and in the ladies' room from scientists who will say, yes, we're there, but we're not really heard. And that's a really tough question. How do you ensure that the people in the room are actually being listened to? And I think we need to do work on that topic. And I hope that the IPCC and other organizations like it take this seriously and begin to think about, well, what would be some of the mechanisms that could be put in place to make sure that scientists from the global south are not just seen, but are also heard.
Rasiel has asked, can you comment on the reliability of natural sciences versus social sciences?
Yeah, well, that's a huge question, and one that I'm likely to get a lot of angry email, depending upon how I answer. So I think that, well, I think two things. First of all, I think the idea that there's a sharp division between the natural and social sciences needs to be let go of, because there certainly are some areas of science, let's say, subatomic physics, in which there's not much obvious social import to the findings, and therefore not a lot of reason to think that social biases would play a big role, although we have evidence that they do sometimes in areas that you wouldn't necessarily expect it. Then on the other extreme, we have, say, something like economics, where everything that economists do is tied up with value questions. And I think many economists have kind of falsely claimed that they can totally isolate the scientific part from the values part. I think that that's not supported by the evidence. But in the middle, there's a host of things that are influenced by our values, our preferences, in ways that we might not expect. And I wrote a paper a few years ago called When Earth Science Became a Social Science, because I was trained as an earth scientist, and I was certainly trained to think of earth science as a physical science, a natural science, that the earth didn't care what we thought about it, and that whether or not plates moved or what the causes of earthquakes were, none of this had anything to do with social considerations. But then we look a little deeper and we see, well, it turns out there are social considerations in a lot of places where we wouldn't have expected it. So some years ago, I did a paper that looked at how hydrological models fared in terms of predicting, what was to come next, right? So these are models of water systems, and they're being modeled by hydrologists who are trained as physical sciences. But it turns out that in many systems, in many places in the world, one of the most important effects influencing hydrological systems are human activities. For example, how much humans pump out of the ground. And in many of these models, the human factor had been ignored because the scientists working on it didn't really know how to model that piece of it, right? Didn't know how to model human behavior. And so the models were inaccurate in their predictions of what would happen in those flow systems. And I think we can find lots of examples of this. So, think of seismology. We think of earthquakes. I mean, an earthquake just happens. The earth doesn't care what we think of it, right? But it turns out that when you pump water into the ground, you can trigger earthquakes. And we've actually known this for a while. So that's a social component in a science that on the face of it seems to be a purely technical one. And I could multiply these examples almost indefinitely. So I think the idea that there's a sharp division in many cases doesn't hold up. And I think so it gets back to this question of evidence. How well supported are the claims by evidence? And have we really looked at all the different aspects of the problem? And so if natural scientists ignore the human component in systems, they will often end up not making accurate predictions of those systems. In a way, you can think of this as sort of a specified example of what we now broadly call the Anthropocene, that the human fingerprints are everywhere. But conversely, if social scientists pretend that they kind of can look at something completely empirically with no influence from their values or preferences, that claim doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. And so it's really an invitation for all of us to think a bit more deeply about the ways in which humans play a role almost everywhere. Maybe not in the nucleus of atoms, but in a lot of things. And the ways in which we do or don't grapple with how our own preferences influence how we see natural systems.
I don't think you would get angry emails about that answer. I thought it was very
okay, good. Thank you. That means I did a good job.
Yeah. John has asked, what is the best way to respond to anti-vaxxers?
Well, this is a very good question, because I think the answer is there isn't one best way. One of the things we've learned from studies of climate change denial, evolution rejection, is that different people can have different reasons for why they reject scientific information. And if you assume that it's just one thing, then there's a good chance that your efforts will fail, because you may be making faulty assumptions about what's actually transpiring. And there's an interesting article that was just published in New England Journal of Medicine on this, and I don't know if you have a website that posts things after the event, but I can send you that link if people are interested. So one of the things that the evidence shows is that one reason that a lot of scientific communication fails, and spoiler alert, I don't think this is exactly saying we don't know. Sometimes scientists can be very arrogant and condescending in their communication, and that just doesn't help, right? So, kind of step one is to take a deep breath and not present yourself as sort of the expert who's now going to pontificate, but to actually try to figure out, at least to some degree, well, where is the resistance coming from? And in the case of COVID-19, one of the interesting things that's come out of recent work, and this is also new, that we don't have a lot of really good data, but we have some data. So we know that some vaccine rejection, and particularly the mask mandate rejection in the United States, I'll just talk about America because that's the case I know best. Here in the United States, some of it was deeply, deeply ideological and tied to conservative resistance to the notion of government telling you what to do. So it's tied up with a notion of American individualism, the sort of, you can call it kind of the cowboy mentality, although that's maybe an insult to cowboys. But, this idea that it's my decision, that I get to decide and the government doesn't get to tell me. And that's very tied up in America and very linked statistically with membership in the Republican Party. So how you address that would be rather different than a different thing that's now emerging associated with the vaccines, which is that many Americans feel that it was rushed. They're worried that because there were emergency authorizations, that these vaccines didn't go through the kind of testing that they would have under normal circumstances, and therefore that they're not safe. And so in a recent poll, it was something like 30% of Americans said they wanted to wait and see, and another 20% said like, no way at all. Well, the no way at all is going to be different than the wait and see. And the wait and see one is tricky because, I mean, here's a good question that I actually don't know the answer to. What does it really mean to say it was an emergency authorization? I've heard scientists say, you know, the standards were not compromised, that these vaccines met the same standard as anything else. Well, then what did it mean to be an emergency? Did it just mean that they met on Saturday night? You know, I haven't heard a good explanation of that, and I follow this pretty closely. So, you know, so in that case, you'd want to talk about, okay, well, I appreciate that concern. I mean, that's, you know, that's not crazy, right? But the emergency authorization actually just means they met on Saturday night or whatever it is, right? Don't quote me on that since I'm just speculating. So the short, this hasn't been a short answer, but the long answer is it's very important to try to begin by understanding where the resistance is coming from and then working from there. I'll just give one more example where we have had some success. So one of the questions that comes up is, well, why do people reject evolutionary theory? And it turns out, again, most of the research I know here is about the United States, but I think a lot of this would probably be true in the UK as well. If you ask people in a sympathetic way, you know, why do you reject evolutionary theory? Some of them will say, because it tells us that life is meaningless. And I don't believe life is meaningless. Well, hello, that's not what evolutionary theory says, right? Evolutionary theory doesn't answer the question of meaning of life because no science can answer the question of meaning of life. So if you're willing to say that, I was like, whoa, hold on, that's actually not true. You know, meaning of life is a really important question, but it's not a question of biology, right? Then you can open up a space for a conversation. And there's been some nice work done by the National Center of Science Education, working with school teachers on this. Also at Arizona State, there have been people working with college students who find that indeed, if you can open up the space to find out what it is the concern is, and then say, well, science doesn't tell us what the meaning of life is. That can be a real game changer for a lot of people. And college professors have found in the study at ASU that once you do that, many students who were resistant to learning evolutionary theory, that resistance lessens or even goes away completely.
I guess it's like, yeah, the empathy and the sympathetic side where you're opening up the conversation and hearing things from their point of view to then see how you can relate.
Right, and I think that's hard for a lot of scientists and academics because we're so used to standing up in front of the classroom and being the authority figure, you know, and pontificating, and that might be okay in some cases. I mean, obviously, I do what I'm doing here today in some ways, right? But to recognize that even though you are the expert about the subject matter, you're not necessarily an expert about the reasons why the person is resisting that subject.
We did have a couple of questions from people saying, like, one example was, 3 of my friends don't want the vaccine and they say the method is to build up their immune systems. How do you counter this? And I feel
Wait, sorry, they say what?
They want to build up their immune systems because they don't want to take the vaccine. How would you counter this?
And how do they propose to build up their immune systems?
We've had a lot of news articles about herd immunity and being thrown around in the UK. I think that probably links to it. But from what you said, it sounds like a conversation, asking them why they think that will work and seeing their point of view and then counteracting with, actually.
Right, exactly, yeah.
This is the data.
Right, exactly. And it's not to say there's not a place for scientific facts and information. There absolutely is, but it's about contextualizing that information to be responsive to what people's concerns actually are.
David has asked, what are the best ways to deal scientifically with future uncertainties that could be existential threats to humanity?
Well, this gets back to the Pascal problem, right? So my view is that there's a sort of middle ground to be struck here. If we deny the uncertainties, then we expose ourselves to exposure, right? Someone can come along and say, oh, well, but what about this uncertainty? What about that? Or what about, this prediction? I mean, one thing I've sometimes seen is people who claim that the predictions of climate science have not come true. And actually, that's not true. I mean, my research associate, Jeffrey Supran, and I are working on this right now. If you look at some of the earlier predictions from climate models compared to what's happened, they're all within the error bars. So this is the whole point of error bars, right? And you can point out to people, assuming that this is a honest conversation and it's not a shill from the fossil fuel industry. Well, this is the whole point of error bars, is to say, we don't know exactly, but there's this range that we believe the answer is. And look, sure enough, if you look at the predictions of earlier climate models, they're all within that range. So this is a question, again, about being honest and transparent about uncertainties. That said, it's also possible to go too far the other way or to misinterpret the meaning of uncertainty. So the IPCC in recent years has spent huge amounts of time and effort on what they call uncertainty characterization, trying to figure out how better to pin down the uncertainties and then to put that information into the IPCC reports. So when the IPCC makes a claim about something like sea level rise, there's a parenthetical that says high certainty or moderate certainty. I think a lot of this has been utterly unproductive. And I say that for two reasons. The first is that if you now try to read an IPCC report, it's practically unreadable. And I've done the exercise with my students of showing them early IPCC reports versus more recent ones. And my students, this is an unscientific, non-representative sample, but for what it's worth, all of my students say that the earlier IPCC reports are better from the perspective of an ordinary person trying to understand what the heck these people are saying. And by larding the reports with all this uncertainty language, it's made it much, much harder to actually grasp what it is these people are trying to say. So I think that's a case where it's sort of like they've overcompensated and they've made it harder to understand the claim. The other thing is that I think some of the uncertainty guidance is based on a mistaken premise. The premise is that the reason the world is not acting on climate change is because the knowledge is too uncertain, and that if only we could make it more certain, we would act. I think all of the evidence is against that hypothesis. My own work in Merchants of Doubt basically says, no, that's not what's going on. There's tremendous political opposition because there are very, very powerful political forces, economic forces, powerful corporations that have done everything in their power to confuse us about climate change and to prevent meaningful action. And so this is about power, with a capital P. And that's something that I think is very hard for scientists to grapple with, because in general, scientists don't like talking about power. They don't like talking about human things in general, in my experience, but also the kinds of people who are attracted to science. We know, again, there are studies on this, who becomes a scientist? Well, one thing we know is that people who like definite answers are much more likely to be attracted to the sciences. People who like open-ended things are more likely to be attracted to the humanities. So that means that people in science, they want a definite answer. They want to think, well, if we could just nail down, if we could say the climate sensitivity is X, the sea level rise by 2100 will be Y. Like, that's very satisfying in many ways. And that's what many scientists want. And so they want to keep working on the science. And that's makes total sense. I used to be a scientist too. When you're a scientist, you want to do science. If you'd wanted to go into politics, you would have gone into politics. But the problem is that now we're in this situation where the obstacles are primarily political. And so what's a scientist to do about that? That's a really hard question. So the impulse of scientists is to want to say, well, we just do more science. We do more science and better science. And we just try to narrow those error bars and, get that third decimal place right. And sometimes narrowing the error bars is a useful thing, but it's not going to answer the problem of the political opposition. And for that, scientists have to, I'd say they have to work with people who are in the political sphere, who understand politics, to think through how they as scientists can contribute in ways that at minimum don't make the situation worse, right? Because a lot of the political strategy, as we showed in Merchants of Doubt, is by creating disinformation. And sometimes scientists inadvertently contribute to that because they think the solution is more information. They create all this more information, but from the public standpoint, it's just this cacophony of claims, and the public ends up, throwing their hands up and thinking they have no idea what to think.
So this links to a couple of questions that we got through. And also we occasionally get comments, or scientists in general seem to get comments about how science is separate from politics and how you should focus on the science. And by what you're saying, it's not. And a couple of people have asked, or would like to know, what is your view on the politicization of science, especially in the USA?
Yeah, well, Exactly. I mean, so science can never be completely extricated from politics when there are political implications to what scientists are doing. That said, I'm not saying scientists should become politicians. I mean, scientists are scientists. That's what they're trained to do. And it's appropriate for them to do the best science that they're able to. It's just important to understand, though, not to get sucked into traps that are sometimes set for them. And I think in the climate space, we've seen scientists fall into a lot of traps because they were not aware of the fact that these were traps. And so it's really what I'm arguing for is a kind of awareness that as a scientist working in the world, and particularly if you work on an issue that has big social, political, economic implications like climate change or like, vaccines, you will encounter these things, even if you don't want to. And so therefore it behooves anyone working in these areas to at least be a little bit aware of what these problems are so as not to fall into the traps.
And Angelina has asked, how can scientists build a stronger, better relationship with politicians, especially regarding climate change, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. And obviously that will be different in different countries. I mean, in Germany, the climate science community has a good relationship with the chancellor. In the United States, in the past, it's been pretty bad. And a lot of that, of course, is not the fault of scientists. It's the fault of the politicians. So these are tricky. The one thing I could say, and this might be a case where what not to do is more obvious than what to do. What not to do is to be arrogant and to think that you're superior. I mean, I once testified in Congress alongside a famous scientist from Harvard. This was before I was at Harvard, so I won't name any names. But when you testify in Congress or any European Parliament, you're given strict instructions about how long to speak. And the politicians want the opportunity to ask you the questions that are on their minds. And in the US Congress, if you go over, there's little lights on the table that start to flash yellow when you're a little bit over and then flash red when you're a lot over. So this colleague of mine prepares this big, long speech. He goes way over time. The yellow light is flashing. He pays no attention. The red light is flashing. He pays no attention. And eventually a senator interrupts him. And then he interrupts the senator back and says, "Excuse me, I'm not done." Now, this particular senator is not one I admire. It's not a person who I agree with about anything, but he's a US senator and he has invited you. And this is your opportunity to speak, not just to him, but also to the audience that is listening and the journalists who will be reporting on it. And I left that day thinking, wow, that guy came across as the stereotype of an arrogant, well, I'll use Cockney rhyming slime, an arrogant glass bowl, and I was stunned. I thought, that's not how you make friends and influence people, right? And I know we know a lot, and I know some scientists are incredibly smart and are incredibly knowledgeable. It's not an excuse for treating a politician with disrespect, even when you don't like, right? And so that to me was a kind of model of what not to do. And it's a reminder, not just in politics, but it relates to our earlier questions about people who, don't want to get vaccines or don't accept evolutionary theory. Even if you disagree, you have to try as much as possible to be respectful. And also to realize that even if you don't like these people, you can still sometimes learn, but it's hard to learn when you're talking and much easier to learn when you're listening. And I think, and myself included, I feel like this is a lesson I've had to learn, because as an academic, you're trained to make your point, right? You're trained to learn how to, articulate what you're trying to say and to say it as clearly and forcefully as you can. And so much of academic training is about how you as an individual say what you want to say and not about how you learn to listen. And so that's something that I think all of us can take on board. I think a lot of us, and I include myself in this, we could learn to be better listeners.
I guess when I think of people getting quite passionate about, I can imagine, or getting quite passionate about topics that if people deny what they're saying, it can be quite risky or cause problems for other people. I can see how you might want to keep talking and tell them the facts and just like try and drill it into their head, but sometimes you just have to step back and
well, right. And it can be really tough because the people may be saying things that are wrong. There's a great, in the film version of our book, there's a great exchange between a Republican Congressman, Bob Inglis, who is accepts the science of climate change and has tried to be a force for good within communities who don't. And so there's this great little vignette where he goes to Mississippi to appear on a radio show, and the guy is just a total out and out climate change denier, and he's saying all these things that are just rubbish. And Bob is sitting there, and you can see he's just trying. He's from South Carolina. He's a very polite person. And he's trying really, really hard to be respectful. And at one point, he just says to the guy, "Well, I'm just going to have to disagree with you there," you know. And it's a really beautiful vignette. It's worth watching to see, you know, it's hard. These things are hard, and you may come across people who you come to the conclusion are hopeless, that there's just nothing you can do here. And so in the film, he leaves with his assistant, and his assistant kind of says, "It seems hopeless." And Bob says, "Well, it's a big battleship. It's going to take time to turn it around." And I think it's such a beautiful episode too, because it's a reminder that these are big problems. Big problems don't get fixed overnight, but that's a challenge to us too, because we know that with respect to climate change, you know, we are so behind on this issue. You know, we are really 30 years behind where we should be. And so it's hard not to be impatient with a problem that's time sensitive like that. And of course, COVID-19 is similar, right? This is an extremely time sensitive issue. But even though that can lead us to become impatient, we have to resist that and try to be patient with people, even when it's really hard.
We have time for a couple more questions. So Vanessa has asked, what is your view on the rise of celebrities or stars becoming the face and voice of popular science?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. It used to drive me nuts, especially because so much of my work is about expertise and about the idea that expertise is specific and that it's really important for us to acknowledge that. One of the ways climate change disinformation works is by putting forward people who are scientists, but who are not climate scientists. And this, I have seen this everywhere from the BBC to the New York Times to who knows what. And so I often stress in my work, and I stress this particularly to journalists, you know, if there's a real debate going on, that's fine. You want to give time. And one of the things we know happens in some communities, like, for example, this is something also going on with COVID-19. If there's a perception that dissent is being suppressed, that can become a reason why some people will then reject, say, getting a vaccination. So it is important to give airtime to, you know, what we used to call legitimate opposing viewpoints in America under the fairness doctrine. But it's also important to recognize that many people who put themselves forward as experts are not. And there's a lot of pseudo experts out there, and those people can do a lot of damage. So then what do we do with celebrities? Celebrities aren't experts. And we've seen celebrities play a very damaging role, particularly here in the United States, in the whole vaccine. Prior to COVID-19, the whole question of MMR vaccines, the idea that they were unsafe and caused autism was promoted a lot in this country by celebrities, particularly an actress named Jenny McCarthy. So it's tempting to say, don't listen to celebrities. What do they know? The problem, though, is that we find in practice, people do listen to celebrities, and it's related to the problem of trust and bonds of affiliation. So one of the things we know from social science research is that people are more likely to trust people they know. And that means friends, neighbors, doctors, nurses, you know, people in your community, your hairdresser. And so this is one reason why it's very, very important not to avoid, quote, controversial topics like climate change, but to talk about them, particularly if you are an expert, to take the opportunities when it's appropriate to talk to people you know about your own information and expertise. But one of the things we also know is that a lot of people feel as if they know celebrities. The relationship that people have with celebrities, you think about, why do people follow celebrities on Instagram or Facebook? It's because there's some feeling of a relationship, even if that relationship is one-sided. Because if they listen to their music or they watch their films, there's a sense of connection. And that connection is very powerful. So this means that when celebrities are willing to speak up on behalf of science, it can be very helpful. So it's a very tricky question. And I don't think we can just say celebrities need to just butt out. I think the key is to try to find ways to work with celebrities in meaningful and effective ways, where if we have that opportunity. I mean, I work with professional athletes, and these professional athletes are incredibly effective, particularly with young people. We send athletes to schools to talk about climate change. These are winter sports athletes, and who talk about how winter is essential for their sport and their livelihood. But one of the things we do is we train them. We have training sessions for the athletes so that they can go out into the world confident that the information they have is correct. And so I think, organizations, charities, organizations like the Royal Institution, where there are opportunities to work with celebrities and create partnerships, I think those can be very valuable, and it's worth the time and effort to build those partnerships where opportunities arise.
A question that kind of asks about what happens when we're looking at theoretical science and not science that we can just prove straight away. So Chin Yang has asked, what role do you think intuition plays in science, especially for theoretical science and theories where the evidence cannot quite reach just yet?
Well, on some level, all science is theoretical, right? Because we're building models. And by that, I don't just mean the physical model like Henry Cadell's miniature mountains, but conceptual models. And all scientists work with conceptual models. So I think this is, again, where the notion of bodies of evidence and communities of experts comes in. So I could have an insight or an intuition about something, and that intuition might be powerful, and it might lead me to some really important ideas. But intuitions can also be massively wrong, right? Our intuitions can misguide us. So if intuition is a starting point for an idea or a concept, I think that's totally fine. I mean, scientists get inspiration from all kinds of sources, right? I mean, there's a famous story about, the benzene ring, coming up in a dream. One time in grad school, I had a dream about my own thesis work, and I woke up so excited thinking that I had solved this problem in my dream. And then when I stopped to think about it, I realized, no, I hadn't. But, but it doesn't really matter where the inspiration comes. The point is that the claims have to be vetted. And so that's where the community structure of science is so important. If that dream had proved to be true, I would have taken the argument, to my colleagues, but I would have had to then work to find evidence to support it. And then my colleagues collectively would judge that evidence. And so that's where, again, as I've said, the community structure is so important. It's not really about what I think as an individual or how I came to that conclusion. It's about whether what I think can stand up to the critical scrutiny of my fellow experts.
And my one last thing, so before we started, you mentioned that as a historian, you don't really have, or generally have heroes because they have feet of clay. But you had some rather nice things to say about Michael Faraday.
Yeah, well, Michael Faraday is my scientific hero, and in part because of the way he was able to visualize scientific ideas and communicate them in really powerful ways. So I wrote a paper in graduate school about his lines of force and the visual representations he used to explain what an electromagnetic field looked like. And it was a very simple thing using iron filing, some like everyday object, but to convey a really, really complicated concept in a simple way. And of course, the Royal Institution, I can make a shameless plug for you guys, has a more than 200-year history of outstanding work in reaching broad audiences. And I think one of the things the Royal Institution has proved is that when you do it well, people are really interested in learning about science. People will come to events. People want to know about the world they live in. And the Royal Institution, in my opinion, has been a leader in this field. So that's why I was very pleased to accept your invitation when you reached out to me.
Well, I'm sure just as pleased as we were when you accepted it.
And I was not paid to say that. I want people to know.
Yes, your donations, audience, do not go to speakers getting paid to say nice things about the Royal Institution.
If I'm lucky, you buy my book and I get about $1 in royalty,
There you go.
Like that.
So that just leaves me to say, first of all, so thank you so much, Naomi, for a brilliant talk and a great conversation afterwards. And also thank you to everyone else who joined us tonight and asked all those brilliant questions.